Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Desi from Clean Air Partnership. With me, it's also Gabi from Clean Air Partnership, and our guest speaker is Anne Bell, Director of Conservation and Education, Ontario Nature. Before I give her the word, I wanted to start with land acknowledgement. Clean Air Partnership acknowledges that the stolen land on which we operate is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Chippewas, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. At Clean Air Partnership, we recognize that Indigenous peoples are particularly vulnerable to climate change and will be disproportionately impacted by its effects. Through our work, we are committed to disrupting ongoing approaches to climate governance that reproduce settler-colonial relations and systematically exclude Indigenous peoples from policymaking. In the next 1 minute, I wanted to share a short video that speak about the Indigenous Peoples History Month.
Ani everyone, June is National Indigenous Peoples History Month and what we know today as Canada. And while learning about the diverse histories and languages and cultures of Indigenous peoples should be a year-long commitment, June is an excellent month to check in with yourself and your learning journey. It's a great time to think about what new resources you want to explore that cover history, languages, culture, and the experiences of Indigenous peoples here in Canada. June is also an excellent month to try something new that you've never done before. Maybe you've never been to a traditional powwow. Maybe you've never spoken an Indigenous language. Well, get in the car, go to a traditional powwow, pick up a language book, and teach yourself how to introduce yourself in an Indigenous language. I encourage you, take time to learn what you can about Indigenous peoples in a safe and ethical way. Turtle Island is a shared space. It's important that we get to know who cared for this land and how we can build relationships. Miigwech for watching.
And Ani Mamwin Coaching, I hope I'm saying it right. But this is what I'm trying to learn out of this video. And this means hi, friends. Before we give it to the word to Anne, I just wanted to remind everyone that the Climate Action Atlas encourages municipalities to explore climate mitigation actions. You can take a look on the link that we're going to share shortly in the chat and see what is in your municipality. And if you're a municipal staff, you can submit your ambitious mitigation projects as well with us. And now we're going to take a very short poll question so that can inform what the audience is, and we're asking you, how familiar are you with the concept of wetland offsetting? And while we're asking, I'm gonna
I'll end this one and share it so we could see where that one is at. So we have a variety, but largely somewhat and not all that familiar. So early days on that one. And then I just will go to the next poll. Sorry, give me 1 sec. And I'll launch this one. Bit one a little bit longer. All right, I think we're getting most of the folks. Oh, still coming more in, sorry. Every time I want to end the poll, someone isn't. All right, I'll end it now and I will share the results.
Thank you very much for answering these questions. And here it's, does your municipality have any policies in place regarding wetland offsetting? Most of the answers go to no or not sure. And did you know that the government of Ontario is proposing to development of provincial offsetting policies? It's half-half. So here we are. We are going to learn more about this with Anne. You can take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending this afternoon, and thank you especially to Gabby and Desi and the Clean Air Partnership for inviting me to speak on this topic. I'm assuming that some of you may have attended our earlier wetland webinars in May, where we outlined the many benefits of wetlands from a climate perspective and some concerns about recent policy changes that weaken wetland protection across Ontario. So I won't repeat all that material today, but we'd be happy to share with you the slide deck or the video recording from the May webinar. For today, though, I'm going to focus on the new Ontario Nature Report that we just released about wetland offsetting policy. Its purpose is to provide local planning authorities and community members with a framework and key information needed to develop and assess effective offsetting policies. Our aim is to advance the best possible outcomes for wetlands and all who depend on them. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, I'm the Director of Education and Conservation at Ontario Nature. Ontario Nature is a charitable organization dedicated to protecting wild species and wild spaces across Ontario through conservation, education, and public engagement. Established in 1931, we now represent over 30,000 individual members and supporters and over 150 member groups across Ontario. And that makes up our nature network. We call it the Nature Network, which is a strong grassroots voice for nature across the province. And you can see where those groups are distributed on the map here. Next slide, please. So Ontario Nature's been working on conservation offsetting generally. Sometimes it's called compensation, sometimes it's called biodiversity offsetting. There are different terms. But anyway, we've been working on this for almost 10 years, undertaking research, publishing reports, and raising public awareness. Our reports include, for example, a 2015 review of biodiversity offsetting a law and policy in 6 jurisdictions, including the US, New Zealand, Australia, Germany, Canada, and BC. In 2017, we jointly published a report featuring 5 case studies on conservation offsetting from an Indigenous perspective. Also in 2017, we published a report focusing specifically on wetland offsetting for Ontario, entitled Navigating the Swamp, which is a pretty apt descriptor, I think. And of course, we have our new report, which we'll be discussing today. All of these reports, by the way, were co-authored with experts in the field. Next slide, please. So it seems like some people are familiar with this concept, some are not at all, and most people are somewhat familiar with the concept of wetland offsetting. But I think the important thing to know is that at its very core, it's a trade-off. It's about trade-offs. Conservation actions are taken to compensate for the adverse effects of development. So basically, a developer is permitted to destroy or damage a wetland under the condition that they create, restore, or enhance a wetland of equal or greater area and value. Offsetting is often premised on the goal of achieving no net loss, or ideally a net gain in wetland area and function. Wetland offsetting, however, is a controversial and extremely risky practice. Research has confirmed again and again that wetland offsets generally fail to fully replace lost wetland values. Policy objectives are rarely achieved, even where rigorous policies are in place. And that's why experts around the world generally agree that offsetting should only be considered as a last resort. Before offsetting is considered, all reasonable actions should be taken to avoid, minimize, and mitigate negative impacts. This is known as the mitigation sequence. Only after those initial steps have been taken should offsetting be considered at all as a strategy to compensate for residual, unavoidable damages. Next slide, please. Our report highlights the 3 major shortcomings of wetland offsetting. First is the temporal loss of wetlands. It can take 10 to 1,000 years for wetlands to fully recover from harmful activities, even when supported by active restoration efforts. So during that interval between negative impact and full recovery, the value of a wetland, for example, for flood control, water purification, wildlife habitat, human use, and more, is diminished or lost altogether. This is referred to in the literature as the time lag. Research also shows that try as we may, humans cannot recreate a wetland that perfectly replaces one that they have destroyed, especially within a meaningful time frame. We simply don't possess that understanding or know-how. Finding a suitable location for the offset is another major challenge, especially in heavily developed areas like Southern Ontario. One needs the right conditions, for example, in terms of hydrology or soil type. And ideally, the offset should be located close to the impacted wetland to ensure that it benefits the same area and communities affected by the loss of the original wetland. Next slide, please. So, does this mean that we should just close the door and say no to offsetting? Well, no, it's not that simple. Unless we can realistically expect that there will be no more development allowed that harms wetlands, then there is a place for offsetting. If development is going to proceed regardless, then compensation through an offset is better than nothing, presumably. Next slide, please. But as a colleague of mine reminded me lately, offsetting to compensate for wetland destruction is like putting lipstick on a pig, and we mustn't allow ourselves to forget this. Offsetting is a band-aid solution, useful perhaps in some cases, but ultimately quite limited. Next slide, please. Conservation offsetting generally is a practice that is gaining in popularity. So it was interesting to see the results of the poll, which shows that for those involved in the webinar today, you're not that, you don't seem to think that there's much going on out there, at least in your experience in your municipalities. But the Greenbelt Foundation did a survey in 2021 and they did a report. And 24 of the 26 municipal and CA survey respondents said that they were participating in offsetting of some sort. Moreover, 15 of the 26 respondents, that is over half, noted that the number of offsetting files seemed to be increasing. Ontario Nature's 2023 review of municipal official plans in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, so that was a review that we did this year, found that about 75% of the official plans had policies requiring some form of compensation. So often the word offsetting is not used, it's referred to as compensation. Anyway, about 75% of the official plans had some form of compensation for damages caused by development. Next slide, please. At the provincial level, the government has proposed to develop a natural heritage offsetting policy. So it seems that there were several people in the audience today that were actually aware of that as well. Anyway, they sought comments on this proposal at the end of last year through the Environmental Registry of Ontario. And the discussion paper that was posted did include a couple of promising elements, and I'd just like to highlight those. First, a policy goal of achieving net gain, so going above and beyond the goal of simply no net loss. And second, it proposed an avoidance first approach, so treating offsetting as the last resort after avoidance, minimization, and mitigation of harm, in step then with the mitigation sequence. We don't know yet what the actual provincial policy will look like, but municipalities need to be prepared for what may come down, what may become a flood of new offsetting proposals once the provincial policy throws open the door. Next slide, please. And that's what our new report is all about, being prepared. And it's now available online on our website. Next slide, please. The report introduces the concept of wetland offsetting and reviews the documented risks. It then presents a 10-point framework for developing, evaluating effective offsetting policy. These 10 criteria, by the way, reflect significant agreement among conservation offsetting experts, including a government-appointed multi-stakeholder group that presented recommendations to the Minister of Natural Resources and Forestry back in 2017. For each of the 10 criteria, the report includes examples and analyses of strong offsetting policies in Ontario, as well as draft policy wording, which can basically be lifted, used, or adapted by planning authorities. Next slide, please. In preparing for the report, we first did a review of wetland offsetting research, essentially updating our knowledge since we issued our last report back in 2017. We then reviewed municipal official plans and conservation authority policies to get a better sense of what was happening on the ground and to identify strong policies that could serve as models for others. Once the report was drafted, it was reviewed by a consultant who was a former municipal planner and by 2 Indigenous colleagues. Their comments and insights improved the report immensely. And so I'm just going to stop here for a minute in case you need any clarifications before I go on to present the evaluation framework in more detail. Are there any questions?
At this point, there is no at the chat. I will invite everyone. If someone wants to speak, you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you, or feel free to write your questions in the chat box.
That sounds great, Desi, and we can if people write it in the chat, then we can take them up towards the end of the presentation too.
Great. Yeah.
Unless there's something that needs to be clarified right away.
I don't see anything right now, so maybe.
Okay. So we'll continue then. So I'm going to quickly go over the 10 criteria that are the backbone of the evaluation framework, which is the backbone of the report. So the first is the commitment to achieving net gain. Offsetting must aim higher than mitigating harm or even achieving a no net loss. We need to reverse the historical and ongoing loss of wetlands in Ontario, and maintaining the status quo is just not sufficient. Second, net gain should be the objective not only in terms of wetland area and extent, but also in terms of the other ecological, cultural, and economic values that are negatively impacted when wetlands are damaged or destroyed. Third, offsetting should be premised on respectful engagement with affected Indigenous communities based on their free, prior, and informed consent. Fourth, as mentioned earlier, offsetting must be treated as a last resort after avoidance and minimizing and mitigating harmful impacts. Fifth, offsetting is simply unsuitable or unworkable for certain wetlands or in certain circumstances, so there must be limits to offsetting for what can be considered for offsetting. The term often used in the literature to define limits is irreplaceable. Bogs and fens, for example, are simply irreplaceable because we can't recreate or restore them in any meaningful human timescale. Provincially significant wetlands are also irreplaceable in the sense that they are just too valuable to lose. There's too much at stake and they must be off limits to offsetting schemes. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, finding the appropriate site to locate an offset is one of the key challenges for successful offsets. Addressing time lags and long-term viability is also an important policy consideration. In addition to addressing temporal losses, policy should ensure that the new or restored wetland is protected for the long term, at least as long as the negative impact endures. Negative impact to the original wetland. The 8th criterion, policy should require that monitoring occurs to ensure that permit conditions and policy objectives are being achieved, and if not, that steps are taken to address shortcomings. Policy should also set out exactly how gains and losses of identified values will be measured. And finally, policy should ensure that there's regular reporting on offset outcomes and that the findings are available to the public in order to hold decision makers and offset providers accountable. So as you can see, these are a very challenging set of criteria, but honestly, if offsetting to have any hope at being effective, they need to be followed. Next slide, please. So for fuller explanations of the criteria and the rationale for them, please see our online primer or the report itself. Both are available on our website. Next slide, please. So for each of the 10 criteria, we attempted to identify examples of exemplary practices from municipal and CA policies. And we were really pleased to report that in many cases, there were some very strong examples. This was particularly true in the case of commitments to net gain, adherence to the mitigation sequence, establishing limits to what can be offset, and strategic site selection. And I'm just going to give you an example now. Next slide, please. Here's an example with regard to the mitigation sequence from the County of Peterborough's official plan. What's noticeable here is that the policy clearly outlines and requires strict adherence to the mitigation sequence. Each stage is defined. Of note is that avoidance is clearly prioritized, since an amendment to the official plan would be required to move beyond the avoidance step in the sequence. Presumably, this requirement would discourage development premised on offsetting without adequate consideration of the earlier stages in the mitigation sequence. Note too, that offsetting is only an option for non-significant wetlands, so a clear limit has been set. Provincially significant wetlands are out of bounds. Next slide, please. The report also highlights, however, some significant policy gaps in the following areas. So they're listed on the slide. Gaps including the failure to include social and cultural values in policy goals, the lack of requirements and guidelines for meaningful and respectful engagement of Indigenous communities, lack of consideration of Indigenous cultural values when setting limits to offsetting, lack of relevant indicators and methods by which to quantify gains and losses, and lack of requirements with regard to public transparency and reporting. So, next slide, please. For those criteria where we didn't have strong existing policies, we hope that the draft policies we have provided will be useful in addressing these gaps. And here's an example regarding the scope of offsetting policy goals. While there are some policies that require offsets to replace both area and ecological function, we could not find an example that considered the social and cultural values of wetlands. Excluding social and cultural values has particularly significant implications for impacted Indigenous communities. So again, for each of the 10 criteria, we put forward a draft policy for consideration like this one. Next slide, please. There's no doubt that offsetting has a long way to go if we are to get to a place where it fully compensates for the damage done. Nevertheless, in a couple of our earlier reports, we did highlight several examples of offsetting where the outcomes, even if not perfect, were certainly positive. These included projects where many, if not all, the criteria we are recommending were followed. For these good news stories, I'd recommend our 2016 report on biodiversity offsetting in Ontario and our 2017 report on Indigenous perspectives on conservation offsetting. Both are available on our website, ontarionature.org, under resources, and we've got all of our reports available there. Next slide, please. What I'd like to highlight in my concluding remarks is that we are faced with both risk and opportunity when it comes to wetland offsetting. The risk is great. And as I've emphasized throughout the presentation, we must be extremely careful when it comes to wetland offsetting. But there's opportunity here as well. If we can't achieve perfection, we can certainly do much better than we've done to date. Municipal planners and community leaders have a vital role to play in developing effective policies that will protect local wetlands and reverse the ongoing trend of wetland loss and decline. There are many who are already setting the example and leading the way, and others need to pick up their trail and join them. Our hope is that this report on wise practices will serve to enhance understanding of the need and options for setting appropriate offsetting policies. In a world where so many natural areas have already been lost or severely degraded, we simply cannot afford to proceed with anything but the utmost caution, always putting our best foot forward. Next slide, please. Thank you. And now, if you have any questions, we'd be happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Annie, for this presentation. Yeah, there's a couple questions coming in. I want to invite also, if you want to ask your questions verbally, raise your hand and we can unmute you. I just wanted to, before I jump to the questions, to clarify that in the report there's suggested language for policy that can be transferable, so different municipalities can directly use that language.
Sure. I mean, it's language that was drafted for us by a planner, and those things can just be lifted or adapted or, you know, taken in whole or in part. but they're suggestions.
Right.
Yep.
And we saw an example from County Peterborough that they use it in their official plan. Is that kind of like a practice that you've seen also somewhere else with instead of having a policy by itself, they first drafted a message and a language in the official plan?
Right. So what was on that slide was actual language straight from the official plan. And so where we could, with for every criteria, we tried to pull up a, 1, 2, or 3 policy examples so that people could see that, good work is being done and good policies out there exist. This is a practice that can be taken up because others have taken it up. But as I mentioned, in some cases, there just aren't appropriate examples. And that's perhaps where these draft policies would be most useful.
Mhm. Thank you. And now we are moving on to the questions. Does offsetting compensation also relate to the loss of woodlands?
Of what land, sorry?
Of woodlands.
Of woodlands, sure. Yes, absolutely. And it's going to be interesting to see the province's new policy is called its new proposed policy is to be a natural heritage offsetting policy. So it will apply, presumably, when we see it, will apply across the board to natural heritage. So wetlands, woodlands, etc.
Thank you. Moving to the next question. Given the release of what seems to be very little change to the PPS and HS policies, how do you see the province implementing an offset policy?
Yeah, this is very interesting. So what that does, presumably, and again, it's hard to know because so many policies interact and it's hard to know how they're all going to fit together at the end of the day. But it looks like they're proposing not to change any of those natural heritage policies in that new section 4 of the provincial planning statement. So it could be that we are going to see, for example, provincially significant wetlands continue to be off limits to offsetting. It's always been a question of interpretation whether the provincial policy statement 2020 actually allowed offsetting or not. And some planning authorities interpreted it as offsetting is allowed, and others interpreted it as offsetting is not allowed. So that's been a matter of interpretation, and probably we'll see things clarified once the new offsetting policy comes out. And I confess I haven't looked closely enough at this, but it appears that even though those natural heritage policies are intact going forward, there have been changes to the definitions, for instance, around significance, that may have an impact on what can or cannot be considered for offsets. So I don't know. I confess I don't know, but that's one thing that we need to look at more closely.
And just for clarification, when is the new offset policy coming out?
I don't know.
Okay.
Good question. Does anybody in the audience have a sense?
Yeah.
Nope, not me.
Yeah, we don't know.
Okay.
I'm monitoring here if there are more questions. Give me a second. Okay. Not at this point. We'll keep people informed if we hear news. We also, Gabi was very nice to share all the links that are because this is, as Annie said, this is the second webinar that we did. So in the chat, we share more information that was shared in the first webinar, as well as the link to the report, to the current link to the report that Annie was just talking. Here is the other question coming up. So how does the changes to OWES impact all of this?
It impacts it hugely, and this is the concern, because those changes to the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System mean that far fewer wetlands will be able to qualify as provincially significant. So baseline is provincially significant wetlands are off limits. Can't touch them. They're protected, except how you evaluate and designate a provincially significant wetland now has been totally revamped, totally overhauled. And what we're going to see is far fewer wetlands designated as provincially significant, and those that are designated currently as provincially significant may well lose that designation. And that's because things like threatened and endangered species and wetland complexing, those are the two big ones, are no longer part of that wetland evaluation process. And also, experts within the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry are no longer going to be involved in reviewing whether an assessment of significance is valid or not. So there's a big question about, okay, so who is going to determine whether wetland evaluation is actually valid? And it looks like it just might be that whatever is determined, whatever an evaluation puts forward is what stands. We don't know. There are some big question marks around that, but for sure, the changes to the O's is going to have a big impact on this stuff.
Thank you, Annie, for answering this question. The next one is, we are starting to see constructed wetlands that primarily function as stormwater facilities be proposed as wetland compensation. Any thoughts on this?
Okay, so that is so terribly frustrating, but that was sort of the point in the webinar about the need to broadly consider the values that are impacted. So if you scope very, very, very narrowly your offset, then it's going to be, first of all, far more likely to proceed. So far more likely that a wetland will be destroyed and replaced by an offset, but also that some of those key values aren't even going to be considered. What does a stormwater pond offer in terms of habitat for species, in terms of cultural value, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, some of these really important items are not even going to be factored into the equation for an offset. So it's bad news.
Bad news. I'm getting angrier here.
Yeah, I tried to give this as positive a frame as I could, but it honestly, it's pretty difficult. And I think I'm enjoying these questions. I appreciate these questions because they help to put things into a context. And all of this depends on the context in which it will be implemented.
There's another question. Is it possible that the province may introduce offsetting as part of a refresh of the Natural Heritage Reference Manual as a whole?
Oh, that's a good question. I honestly don't know. Not sure. I don't know how they're going to introduce it, but presumably it's going to be a big policy, and how it gets applied is the question.
Oh, for those person who asked for the woodland, yes, it is related to the loss of woodland. There was some clarification here. And if anyone else want to jump in and either leave a comment or speak up, I'll invite you to raise your hand and we'll unmute you. What else what's the voice, like how a municipal voice can be used to advocate for this?
That's a great question, Desi. So the province is going to be bringing in supposedly a policy, but that policy is going to have to be implemented at the local level, and that's where municipalities can play a huge role, because they can set the rules for how offsetting is going to play out in their communities. I think we all know that the province has given itself more power to override rules that are set at the municipal level. Nevertheless, I think at the municipal level, we need to set those rules, and we need to stand up when things are undone. There's an implication for everyone from these changes, and we need to be aware of that, and we need to, bear witness to what's happening. Stand up for what you believe in, stand up for what's right, stand up for what will offer the best outcomes for wetlands and communities, and do your best and fight when attempts are made to undo what you've done. It's easy to say. I understand that. Easy to say, probably comes at huge expense, but ideally that's what would be done.
Here, Gabby's throwing a question in the chat, which is, have any of you seen the changes to the wetland evaluation system became a discussion in council? You can just answer in the chat. That's for the audience and for municipal staff to say if council members are aware of the changes of the wetland system. And while you're answering this question, or I hope some of you will be responding in the chat, but there is another question here. For woodland compensation laws, municipalities with the GTA often will ask applicants to use the TRCA methodology for ecosystem compensation. Would you suggest an alternative methodology?
I think TRCA's framework for compensation is excellent. We've reviewed it, and the TRCA is in the process. I don't know whether they finished or not, but certainly we commented on a review that they were doing about that process. So absolutely look to the TRCA, but look as well to the other examples that we provide. There are at least 3 other CAs that have done really solid work on wetland or on compensation generally, on ecosystem compensation, conservation compensation, whatever you want to call it. There are other conservation authorities that have done great work as well. So yes, TRCA has, they've been a leader. They were the first one out of the gate, and now they're looking to revamp and improve their policies. So absolutely look to them. But don't just look there, look to others as well. If you go to our primer online, there are links there under resources to these other CA policies, if you want to take a look.
Oh, thank you very much of Alex Hilson is responding from Councillor in Halton Hills that he was aware of the changes. And we see more comments in the chat, which is great. Thank you very much. Yes, we're going to share. So we're going to share recording and the slide presentation. And Annie, where is the link that you just mentioned of resources of other CAs?
Okay.
Is that in the report?
Yes. Well, it's better. It's easier to find because you can just click it if you go to our primer.
Okay.
So on our website, under campaigns, you'll find the wetland campaign. And then from that wetland campaign, you can go straight to the primer, and there's a page in the primer on resources.
With the proceedings, I'm going to find it for everyone, and I'm going to add that link as well. And we will be sending the recording and the slides probably by mid next week. Meanwhile, there's some other questions. Are other provinces doing the same thing?
Other provinces have gone down the road. I haven't actually looked at this since we did our review of the jurisdictions back in 2017. But certainly BC, Alberta, we're going down the road. And I'm not sure, honestly, what other Canadian provinces have gone down the road.
I wonder if they have the same challenges like in Ontario. And is there a way that this can be a federal protection land?
So the federal government also is developing an offsetting policy. We commented on that late last year, I think it was. So we'll see what comes out federally. Hopefully it'll be strong. The challenge being, of course, that a lot of what happens in Ontario is not on federal land, so it's kind of outside of the jurisdiction to some degree.
Mhm. Right. We have some comment that city planning in Toronto did submit comments to the ERO on the OWES posting, which is good, and we encourage other municipalities also to submit. And I think Gabby is preparing for some questions that are good to be brought to the councillor or to the upper management in municipalities to discuss regards wetlands. I'm also monitoring for some more questions. Okay.
Sorry, I'm just having trouble cutting and pasting for some reason. It won't let me, but I will put it as part of the proceedings. There's a series of questions that we're kind of say like these are good questions for municipalities to be asking themselves. And I don't know why I'm having this issue. I must have been something. Must be something with my. I will fix it and I will put it in. And if I can't figure it out, we will definitely put it as part of the proceedings.
Thanks, Gabby. I will leave some more time for folks to think about and ask their questions. Meanwhile, I had prepared some questions, but I got also a bit emotional here of like, oh, what is the right, like what we supposed to do so we can protect this lands?
I appreciate that response. No, seriously, we have to feel it in our hearts, right? That there are some things that aren't acceptable and we have to do better.
Yeah. And there's also, oh, sorry, Gabby. No, I was just thinking, is it like, if like destroying it for the development of wetland, isn't it that it has a flooding problems or any other issues, so that the development is actually gonna cost money for the municipality on a long term?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's something, Desi, that we covered a little bit more in one of those previous webinars, and we went into the benefits that wetlands provide. But one of the studies that was looked at said that the costs associated with destroying or maintaining wetlands on the landscape. Oh, I'm going to get it wrong. Anyway, there's a study that shows that it's hugely cost effective to maintain wetlands rather than to have them destroyed and replaced with some other sort of gray infrastructure. Wetlands themselves provide benefits of over $51 billion per year in Southern Ontario alone. That was another study that was done. Huge economic implications and huge climate implications in terms of our ability to be resistant and resilient to change.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key questions. I know some of the municipalities, Desi, I just emailed you the questions which for some reason are not copying and pasting. I have no idea why that is. But really what it comes down to is explore how the municipality can analyze and report on the likelihood and cost of wetlands being lost to development. Like it's a liquidation of a natural capital asset that now has to be compensated for via gray infrastructure. So that has a direct cost to the municipality that needs to be considered. And really comes down to report on how the municipality thus far tracks permeable versus impermeable surfaces across the community over time. How can municipal policies and zoning bylaws provide sufficient protection for wetlands, especially in light of the recent provincial policy changes, which means the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System is one of the key questions that municipalities can kind of explore to see what policies do they have in place, or what policies could they put in place to better protect wetlands within their community to avoid the flood risk. It may also be very interesting for many municipalities to explore how municipalities upriver, from their jurisdiction are how are they protecting wetlands? Because that will have direct implications for downstream flood risk. So those are some of the kind of key questions. What kind of future data is taken into consideration thus far in stormwater management plans? So that's a key question that municipalities should be exploring, bringing in future climate data into their stormwater plans if they have not done that already. And how the asset management plans incorporate stormwater infrastructure, and whether the municipality has a stormwater charge in place to try and raise the revenue it needs for its stormwater management, or whether that's just using the general tax base to achieve the stormwater outcomes that they want as well. And then costs and benefits of maintaining green stormwater infrastructure and land use permeability in comparison to investing in gray infrastructure. So if you then change a wetland and you have to provide gray infrastructure, and I have to say, like, while the province has said, I mean, only relating to the development charges implications, they did say that they were going to make municipalities whole for changes from Bill 23. So I would still think that it's really important for municipalities to track this type of implications of these provincial policies and what it means to their budget costs as a whole as well. So that's important to kind of take into consideration, because it is a downloading kind of policy that's putting a whole bunch of costs onto municipalities. You would be getting revenue in the form of developments in taking place there in terms of taxes and development charges, but that also needs to be taken into consideration with the cost associated with that development, not only for that site, but the municipality as a whole.
Right.
That was just my diatribe, or my therapy, I guess.
And-
Got to take where you can get it.
And I did share, Gabby, the questions.
Thank you.
And we'll be, as Gabby mentioned, we'll be sending it together with all the proceedings, so you have it in your email box as well. We do have more time, but I don't see more questions coming in. And do you have any last thoughts or comments?
No, just I'm happy to continue this discussion with anyone who's interested. So don't hesitate to reach out to me at Ontario Nature. My email address is anneb@ontarionature.org.
And then you're okay if we put your contact information
Yep.
in the proceedings so that people can get in touch with
Absolutely.
you, right?
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I don't know, Gabby, do you have any last comments, remarks? You're muted.
Sorry, we can give people 12 minutes back in their life.
Yes, yes.
Thanks everybody for being here.
Oh, I will someone just mentioned about the website. Can we find info on the CAs under primers, but I don't see it. So we will definitely send that the CA info and the proceedings as additional resources for folks as well.
Yes. And with that, we're concluding this webinar. Have a good day for the rest of the day, and we'll be sending everything by mid next week. Thank you very much, Anne, for your time and for the presentation. And thanks everyone for joining us. Have a good day. Bye.